Move her away from the operating wing. Now. The command cracked through the surgical corridor like a fire alarm, sharp enough to stop conversations and turn heads. At 7:11 a.m., the fourth-floor surgical wing of St. Catherine Medical Center was running with the precision of a machine. Nurses pushed carts loaded with supplies. Residents reviewed charts on tablets. Families sat quietly along the walls, waiting for updates they hoped would bring relief. Then all of that attention shifted toward one woman standing near the secured entrance to Operating Room 3. Naomi Carter didn't move. She stood calmly in dark jeans, white sneakers, and a navy jacket, holding a slim tablet against her side. Nothing about her appearance suggested authority. No badge hung from her neck. No security detail followed behind her. No one around her had any reason to believe she controlled a healthcare network worth billions of dollars. And that was exactly how she wanted it. Across from her stood Dr. Richard Hale, the celebrated chief of surgery. At 52, he was considered untouchable inside these walls. His reputation filled magazine covers and hospital fundraisers. When he spoke, people listened. When he pointed, people moved. Right now, he was pointing directly at Naomi. "This area is restricted," he said, his voice carrying through the corridor. "You can't stand here." Naomi met his gaze. "I'm not interfering with anyone." "That's not for you to decide," Richard replied. A few staff members exchanged glances. Some slowed their pace just enough to watch. Naomi remained composed. She had seen this before. Not this hallway. Not these faces. But this exact assumption. The belief that someone who looked like her couldn't possibly belong in a place like this. A nurse manager named Linda Crawford stepped forward. "Ma'am, family members need to wait in designated areas." Naomi answered evenly. "I'm not here as family." Linda folded her arms. "Then you're definitely in the wrong place." A couple of nearby residents chuckled. Richard gave a short, dismissive nod. "Please escort her back to the public waiting area." The words landed harder than he intended. Not because they were loud. Because they were familiar. Naomi looked around the corridor. Bright fluorescent lights reflected across polished floors. Monitors beeped in distant rooms. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and coffee. Everything appeared professional, controlled, efficient. Yet underneath it, something felt wrong. For 3 months, complaints had arrived at corporate headquarters. Patients reporting disrespect. Families describing unequal treatment. Staff members quietly resigning. Anonymous reports that seemed too consistent to ignore. That was why Naomi was here before sunrise. No announcement. No entourage, just observation. She wanted to see the culture with her own eyes. And after less than 10 minutes inside the surgical wing, she already had. Richard took a step closer. "You're holding up operations." Naomi's expression never changed. "Am I?" "Yes." His jaw tightened. "People who belong here are trying to work." The corridor fell silent. Even the nearby conversation stopped. Several employees looked away. Others stared openly. Naomi stood as still as a statue. Then, for the first time, she felt something shift beneath the polished surface of the department. Not fear. Not anger. Recognition. Because the problem she came to investigate had just introduced itself. And it was standing right in front of her. Naomi Carter had learned a long time ago that people revealed their true character when they believed no one important was watching. That lesson had built an empire. 18 months earlier, Carter Health Systems had completed the acquisition of St. Catherine Medical Center after a year of negotiations and regulatory reviews. The hospital had impressive numbers, respected specialists, and one of the busiest surgical programs in the state. On paper, everything looked exceptional. Inside executive reports, however, another pattern had begun to emerge. Complaints arrived from patients who felt dismissed. Families reported being treated differently, depending on how they looked or where they came from. Employee surveys described a culture that rewarded status and ignored concerns. Separately, none of those reports seemed alarming. Together, they formed a picture Naomi could not ignore. That was why she was standing in this hallway before most executives were even awake. She had not announced her visit. She had not informed department leadership. Even the hospital president believed she was attending meetings across town later that morning. Naomi preferred it that way. The moment people knew the chief executive was coming, behavior changed. Smiles appeared. Policies were followed. Problems disappeared just long enough to survive an inspection. What she wanted was reality. And reality was standing only a few feet away. Around her, the surgical wing continued moving. Nurses checked schedules. Residents hurried between stations carrying tablets and coffee cups. Families sat in rows of chairs, studying every face that emerged from secured doors. The department looked efficient from a distance, but Naomi noticed details others missed. She saw how certain questions were answered immediately while others were brushed aside. She noticed which people received patience and which received irritation. Years of leading hospitals had trained her to read a room faster than any report ever could. Near the end of the corridor, a young woman in navy scrubs paused beside a workstation. Her name badge identified her as Dr. Maya Brooks, a third-year surgical resident. Unlike everyone else, Maya was not staring at Naomi with annoyance. She looked confused, as if she recognized something she could not quite place. Maya glanced toward Richard Hale, then back toward Naomi. For a moment, it seemed she wanted to say something. Instead, she remained silent and returned her attention to the screen in front of her. Richard appeared satisfied that he had established control of the situation. He adjusted his white coat and exchanged a confident smile with Linda Crawford. To them, Naomi was simply another inconvenience in a busy morning. Another person who needed to be redirected. Another stranger who did not belong. What neither of them realized was that every word spoken in the last few minutes had confirmed exactly why she came. The complaints were not random. The stories were not exaggerated. There was a culture here, hidden beneath credentials and polished reputations. Naomi could feel it in the atmosphere. The surgical wing was proud of its excellence. But somewhere along the way, excellence had become entitlement. And entitlement had become something much harder to defend. Standing quietly beneath the bright corridor lights, Naomi made a mental note. The inspection had barely begun, yet the department had already started writing its own report. By 7:18 a.m., the mood inside the surgical wing had changed. The initial curiosity surrounding Naomi Carter had hardened into something else. Irritation, assumption, quiet judgment. Dr. Richard Hale moved through the corridor with the confidence of a man who had spent years being the most important person in every room he entered. Staff members stepped aside when he approached. Residents straightened their posture. Nurses adjusted schedules the moment he spoke. Inside the department, Richard was more than a surgeon. He was an institution. That reputation followed him everywhere. Awards lined the walls bearing his name. Photographs from medical conferences filled display cases near the elevators. Hospital newsletters praised his leadership. Patients requested him specifically. To many people, Richard Hale represented excellence itself. And that was precisely why no one questioned him. Naomi noticed it immediately. Every time Richard spoke, agreement followed. Every time he made an assumption, others treated it like fact. Linda Crawford mirrored his attitude almost perfectly. She remained near the secured entrance, occasionally glancing toward Naomi as if expecting her to leave at any moment. Instead, Naomi remained exactly where she was, observing. The longer she stayed, the more comfortable people became revealing themselves. Two residents walked past carrying charts. One glanced toward Naomi and lowered his voice. "I do not know why she is still here." His colleague shrugged, probably looking for attention. Neither realized Naomi heard every word. Near a waiting area, an elderly Hispanic man approached a nurse with a question about his wife's surgery schedule. The nurse barely looked up from her computer before directing him elsewhere. Minutes later, a well-dressed donor arrived asking about a physician, and the same nurse immediately stood, smiled, and offered assistance. The contrast lasted less than 30 seconds. It was enough. Naomi added another mental note. Across the corridor, Dr. Maya Brooks continued watching from a distance. Something about Naomi clearly bothered her, though not in the same way it bothered everyone else. Maya kept studying her face, searching her memory. Finally, she approached another resident standing beside a workstation. "Do you know who that woman is?" she asked quietly. The resident glanced over and laughed. "Someone who cannot follow directions." Maya frowned. "I think I have seen her before." "Trust me," he replied. If she mattered, Richard would know. Those words lingered in the air longer than he intended. If she mattered, Naomi had heard variations of that sentence throughout her life. Different voices, different places, same meaning. People deciding someone's value before learning a single fact about them. Richard returned from a nearby consultation room, carrying a tablet. The moment he saw Naomi still standing there, his expression tightened. "You are still here?" he asked. Naomi answered calmly. I am. Richard shook his head. This department handles some of the most complex procedures in the region. We do not have time for distractions. Several staff members nearby nodded in agreement. Naomi studied their faces. Nobody asked who she was. Nobody asked why she had come. Nobody showed curiosity. They had already reached a conclusion. That was what concerned her most. Not the comments. Not the dismissive tone. The certainty. The surgical wing operated like a kingdom, and Richard Hale sat firmly on its throne. Around him stood people who had stopped questioning authority because authority had become part of the culture itself. And somewhere beneath that culture, Naomi suspected she would soon find exactly what she came looking for. At 7:24 a.m., the corridor had settled into an uneasy rhythm. People were working, talking, moving, but attention kept drifting back toward Naomi Carter. She had become the subject nobody wanted to discuss openly and nobody could completely ignore. Dr. Maya Brooks felt it more than anyone. The feeling had been bothering her for nearly 10 minutes. She knew that face. Not personally. Not from a meeting. Not from the hospital. Somewhere else. Somewhere important. Maya stared at a screen in front of her, pretending to review patient notes while her memory searched for answers. Then it hit her. 6 months earlier, she had attended a leadership conference sponsored by Carter Health Systems. Hundreds of residents from across the country had watched a keynote address streamed onto a giant screen. The speaker had discussed patient dignity, accountability, and trust. Maya remembered because it was one of the few presentations that had actually inspired her. Slowly, her eyes widened. She looked back toward Naomi. The same calm posture. The same steady expression. The same voice she had heard during the presentation. Maya felt a chill travel through her chest. No, that could not be possible. She stood from her workstation and walked toward another resident. I think I know who she is, Maya whispered. The resident barely looked up. The woman causing problems? Maya frowned. No, I mean really know who she is. Before the resident could respond, Richard Hale emerged from a consultation room carrying a patient file. His presence immediately shifted attention back toward him. Maya hesitated. Speaking up against Richard was not something people did casually. He controlled recommendations, evaluations, fellowships, and careers. One negative opinion from him could follow a resident for years. Still, something felt wrong. More wrong than it had a few minutes earlier. Maya glanced toward a nearby workstation displaying surgical schedules. One patient record near the top caught her attention. The case had been marked urgent the previous afternoon. Now the priority status had changed. She frowned and refreshed the screen. The information remained the same. Confused, she checked another schedule. Then another. A pattern began emerging. Several patients who had originally been flagged for accelerated review no longer carried the same designation. Maya looked around carefully. No one else seemed concerned. She quietly approached a senior nurse. Did these case priorities change? She asked. The nurse barely glanced at the screen. Administration adjustments. Who authorized them? I do not know. The answer came too quickly, too rehearsed. Maya looked back at Naomi. Suddenly the complaints she had heard whispered around the hospital felt different. More real. Less like rumors. Across the corridor, Richard noticed Maya watching. Dr. Brooks, he called. Is there a reason you were standing there instead of preparing for rounds? Maya straightened immediately. No, sir. Richard nodded with visible satisfaction. Good. The conversation ended. But the doubt did not. Maya returned to her workstation and quietly opened the leadership conference archive on her tablet. Within seconds, a photograph appeared on the screen. A woman standing behind a podium. The caption beneath the image read, Naomi Carter, Chief Executive Officer, Carter Health Systems. Maya stared at the photograph. Then she looked across the corridor at the woman everyone had spent the last 20 minutes dismissing. Her heartbeat accelerated. Around her, the surgical wing continued operating as if nothing unusual was happening. Yet Maya suddenly understood something nobody else did. The most important person in the entire hospital had already arrived. And the people treating her like she did not belong had no idea how close they were to a disaster of their own making. At 7:31 a.m., tension settled over the surgical wing like a storm cloud nobody wanted to acknowledge. Dr. Maya Brooks stared at the photograph on her tablet one final time before locking the screen. Her pulse raced. She knew exactly who Naomi Carter was. More importantly, She knew what would happen if nobody spoke up soon. Maya took a step forward, then stopped. Around her, the department continued orbiting around Richard Hale. Nurses moved from station to station. Residents prepared for rounds. Administrators checked schedules. Yet beneath the routine, something had shifted. The air felt heavier, as if the corridor itself was waiting for a decision. Richard noticed Naomi still standing near the secured entrance and finally lost what little patience remained. "This has gone on long enough," he said sharply. Several employees immediately turned toward him. "You have been asked repeatedly to leave this area." Naomi looked at him calmly. "I have heard you." "Then act on it." Richard glanced toward Linda Crawford. "Call security." The words echoed farther than he intended. A few nearby family members looked up from their chairs. Conversation stopped. Linda immediately reached for her phone. Naomi did not move. She did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She simply stood there, watching. That composure seemed to frustrate Richard even more. "You are disrupting hospital operations," he continued. "You do not belong in this department." Maya felt her stomach tighten. Those words landed harder than anyone realized, because they were not about policy anymore. They were about judgment, assumption, authority deciding who deserved to occupy space. A security supervisor appeared moments later from the elevator lobby. He approached professionally but cautiously. "Is there a problem here?" Richard answered before anyone else could speak. "Yes. We have an individual refusing repeated instructions." The supervisor nodded and turned toward Naomi. "Ma'am, would you mind coming with me?" Naomi met his eyes. "Before I do that, may I ask a question?" The supervisor hesitated. "Go ahead. Has anyone asked why I am here?" Silence followed. The question hung in the corridor like a spotlight. Nobody answered. Because the truth was simple. No one had asked. They had assumed. Richard folded his arms. "Your reason for being here is irrelevant." Naomi studied him for several seconds. Something in her expression changed. Not anger. Not frustration. Recognition. The kind that comes when a final piece of a puzzle falls into place. Suddenly, she remembered another hospital hallway nearly 25 years earlier. She had been 22 years old, exhausted after driving through the night to visit her mother following a medical emergency. A staff member had stopped her before she reached the intensive care unit. He never asked who she was, never asked why she was there. He simply looked at her, decided she did not belong, and directed her toward the exit. The embarrassment of that moment had stayed with her for years. Standing in this corridor now, the memory returned with startling clarity. Different building, different faces, same assumption. Naomi slowly exhaled and looked around the surgical wing one more time. The complaints, the dismissive comments, the altered priorities Maya had discovered, the culture of unquestioned authority. Everything was becoming clearer. Richard believed he was protecting his department. In reality, he was exposing it. And although nobody else knew it yet, the department had just reached the point where consequences were no longer a possibility. They were a certainty. At 7:36 a.m., the corridor stood suspended between routine and something far more serious. The security supervisor remained near Naomi Carter, waiting for an answer. Richard Hale stood with folded arms, convinced the situation was finally ending. Linda Crawford watched with quiet satisfaction. Around them, nurses, residents, and family members pretended to focus on their own business, but their attention kept returning to the woman everyone seemed determined to remove. Naomi glanced once toward the secured operating wing doors, then reached into her jacket pocket and removed her phone. The movement appeared ordinary, small, almost forgettable. Richard smirked. "Calling someone to pick you up?" Naomi ignored the comment. Her thumb moved across the screen. A single contact opened immediately. Monica Reed, Chief Executive Operations Office. Monica answered before the first ring fully ended. "Good morning, Naomi." Her voice was calm and professional. Naomi looked down the length of the corridor. "I have seen enough." Silence followed for a fraction of a second. Then Monica's tone changed. "Understood." Naomi spoke only 6 words. "Lock the department. Begin review." Monica did not ask questions. She never needed to. Initiating executive compliance protocol now. The call ended. Richard laughed softly. Very dramatic. Several employees nearby smiled. To them, it sounded like an empty threat. Another frustrated visitor pretending to have influence. Naomi slipped the phone back into her pocket and said nothing. That silence unsettled Maya Brooks more than any argument could have. She knew exactly who Monica Reed was. Every executive within Carter Health Systems knew that name. Maya suddenly felt the urge to speak, but uncertainty still held her in place. Across the corridor, computer monitors began refreshing. One nurse frowned at her screen. A scheduling coordinator looked confused. Another employee attempted to access a patient management file and blinked twice. "That is strange," he muttered. Richard remained focused on Naomi. "You know what your problem is?" he asked. "You think confidence can replace credentials." Naomi met his eyes. "Interesting observation. People like you walk into places like this and assume they deserve special treatment." The words echoed through the hallway. Several heads turned immediately. Maya felt her stomach drop. Even Linda appeared uncomfortable. Yet Richard continued. "This department operates on standards." Naomi nodded slowly. "It should." A notification suddenly chimed from a workstation. Then another, and another. The sound spread through the corridor like falling dominoes. Employees looked toward their screens. Expressions shifted from confusion to concern. One administrator stood up, so quickly her chair rolled backward several feet. "Dr. Hale," she called. Richard turned. "What?" "I cannot access scheduling approvals." Another voice followed. "My administrative permissions just disappeared." A third employee looked down at a monitor. "Why is compliance requesting department records?" The atmosphere changed instantly. The confidence that had filled the corridor only moments earlier began leaking away. Richard frowned and walked toward the nearest workstation. On the screen, a bright notification banner stretched across the top of the display. He read it once, then again. The color drained from his face. Around him, more notifications appeared across computers throughout the surgical wing. Every screen carried the same message. Executive Compliance Review activated. Department access restrictions in progress. Please await further instructions. For the first time that morning, nobody was looking at Naomi, as if she did not belong. They were looking at her, as if they had finally realized they never understood who was standing in front of them at all. The corridor became so quiet that the soft hum of ventilation systems suddenly sounded loud. Every employee in the surgical wing stared at the screens around them. Richard Hale remained frozen beside the workstation, reading the notification again as if the words might change. They did not. Executive Compliance Review activated. Department access restrictions in progress. Please await further instructions. Linda Crawford walked toward another computer. Her hands moved quickly across the keyboard. Nothing happened. She tried again. The system rejected her credentials. Across the hallway, a scheduling coordinator attempted to access departmental records. Denied. A nurse manager opened an administrative dashboard. Denied. One by one, the people who had controlled every decision inside the department discovered that control was slipping away. Richard slowly turned toward Naomi Carter. For the first time that morning, confidence was missing from his expression. "What exactly did you do?" he asked. Naomi stood calmly beneath the bright corridor lights. "I asked a question when I arrived." Richard frowned. "What does that mean?" "I asked whether anyone wanted to know why I was here." Nobody spoke. The answer remained the same as before. No one had asked. Maya Brooks stepped forward at last. Her voice was steady despite the tension surrounding her. "Because they assumed they already knew." Several heads turned toward her. Richard stared in disbelief. "Dr. Brooks, stay out of this." Maya shook her head. "No, sir." The words landed harder than anyone expected. "You never asked her name. You never asked her purpose. You never asked for identification. You decided she did not belong the moment you saw her." Silence spread through the corridor. The truth was impossible to ignore because everyone had witnessed it happen. Richard looked from Maya to Naomi and back again. "Who are you?" he finally asked. Naomi studied him for several seconds before answering. "That should have been your first question." Another notification chimed. From multiple computers simultaneously. This time the message appeared on larger display monitors throughout the surgical wing. Staff members turned toward the screens. Family members waiting in nearby seating areas stood up. Even the security supervisor looked upward. A new banner appeared. Executive Oversight Review authorized. Carter Health Systems Corporate Office. Then another line followed beneath it. Authorized by Chief Executive Officer Naomi Carter. The reaction was immediate. Shock moved through the hallway like a wave. One resident actually stepped backward. Linda's face lost all color. The security supervisor lowered his hands and took several careful steps away from Naomi. Maya closed her eyes briefly. She had known the truth already, but seeing it displayed across every monitor made the moment feel different. Real. Permanent. Richard stared at the screen, then at Naomi, then back at the screen again. The distance between certainty and disbelief had never looked larger. Naomi finally broke the silence. Her voice was calm, measured, unshaken. You ignored concerns. You dismissed questions. You judged people before speaking to them. Nobody interrupted. Nobody could. And this morning, she continued, you spent nearly half an hour trying to remove the chief executive officer from a hospital she owns because you decided appearance mattered more than facts. The corridor stood completely still. Richard opened his mouth, but no words came out. Naomi looked around at the department that had treated authority like a private possession. Then she delivered the sentence that would echo through the hospital long after the morning ended. You did not fail because you made a mistake, she said. You failed because you never believed one was possible. For several long seconds, nobody moved. The surgical wing looked frozen in time. Nurses stood beside workstations. Residents remained in place holding tablets. Administrators stared at monitors displaying compliance alerts that continued multiplying across the system. The authority that had dominated the department only minutes earlier was unraveling in plain sight. Then another notification appeared. This one carried a distinct tone that echoed from computers throughout the floor. Employees immediately looked toward their screens. Department review status updated. Administrative access suspended pending investigation. Compliance teams en route. Linda Crawford rushed to another terminal. She entered her credentials again. Access denied. She tried a second time. The same result. Nearby, a department coordinator attempted to open scheduling controls and received an identical message. One after another, layers of authority disappeared behind locked permissions. Richard Hale remained motionless. The confidence that once surrounded him had vanished completely. He looked less like the ruler of a prestigious department and more like a man watching a reality he no longer controlled. Naomi Carter did not celebrate. She did not smile. She simply observed. Across the corridor, Monica Reed's voice came through Naomi's phone. Compliance auditors have arrived in the building. Human resources leadership has been notified. Legal review teams are accessing departmental records now. Naomi nodded. Thank you. The call ended. Around the hallway, whispers spread rapidly. Family members waiting for updates exchanged confused looks. Residents quietly discussed the notifications appearing on every screen. For the first time all morning, people were asking questions instead of making assumptions. Maya Brooks watched it happen with a mixture of relief and disbelief. She had spent years hearing people speak about accountability. Now she was watching it arrive in real time. A senior administrator hurried from an elevator carrying a tablet. Behind him walked two members of the corporate compliance division. Their arrival changed everything. Employees immediately stepped aside. The administrator approached Naomi first. Good morning, Ms. Carter. His voice carried through the corridor. We are prepared to begin the review. Every remaining doubt disappeared. Richard lowered his eyes. Linda looked toward the floor. The security supervisor quietly stepped away from the center of the hallway. Nobody questioned Naomi's presence anymore. The evidence surrounded them. The administrator continued. Initial findings indicate concerns involving patient prioritization procedures, complaint handling practices, and departmental oversight. The words landed heavily. Maya remembered the altered case priorities she had noticed earlier. Suddenly those details felt much more important. Naomi looked toward the staff gathered throughout the corridor. A review is not a punishment, she said calmly. It is a search for truth. No one interrupted. If procedures were followed correctly, the records will show it. If they were not, the records will show that too. Richard finally spoke, his voice noticeably quieter than before. You planned this. Naomi met his gaze. No, I planned a visit. She paused. The department created the rest. Silence followed. The statement was impossible to argue with because everyone had witnessed the morning unfold. Nobody had been forced to make assumptions. Nobody had been instructed to dismiss questions. Those choices belonged entirely to the people who made them. As compliance teams moved deeper into the department and access restrictions continued spreading through hospital systems, the surgical wing faced something it had not experienced in years. Accountability. And standing quietly at the center of it all was the woman they had spent the entire morning trying to remove. By 7:52 a.m., the surgical wing looked completely different from the place Naomi Carter had entered less than an hour earlier. The polished hallways were the same. The operating rooms were the same. The monitors still glowed beneath fluorescent lights. Yet the atmosphere had changed. The certainty was gone. In its place stood reflection. Compliance teams continued reviewing records. Administrators moved quietly between workstations. Conversations that once carried confidence now carried caution. People were no longer asking who held authority. They were asking whether authority had been used correctly. Naomi stood near the same secured entrance where the morning's confrontation had begun. The difference was that nobody was trying to remove her anymore. Nearby, Maya Brooks watched the scene unfold. She thought about how quickly assumptions had collapsed once facts entered the room. Hours of training, years of credentials, impressive titles, and reputations. None of them had protected people from the consequences of their own choices. Richard Hale remained silent. The man who had dominated every conversation earlier that morning now looked smaller somehow. Not because his position had changed in that moment, but because perspective had. For years he had been surrounded by agreement. Surrounded by people who stopped challenging him. Surrounded by a culture that rewarded confidence more than curiosity. Naomi understood that danger better than most leaders ever would. She had seen organizations fail because nobody asked difficult questions. She had seen talented people leave because nobody listened. She had seen patients lose trust because dignity was treated as optional. A hospital could survive mistakes. It could recover from setbacks. What it could not survive was a culture that stopped seeing people. Monica Reed called one final time. The review team is fully established. Preliminary findings will be delivered by the end of the day. Naomi nodded. Thank you, Monica. She ended the call and looked around the corridor. Staff members paused what they were doing. Even family members waiting nearby seemed to sense that something important was about to be said. Naomi's voice was calm, but every word carried through the hallway. A hospital is not measured by awards on a wall. Nobody moved. It is not measured by rankings, publicity, or prestige. She paused. It is measured by how people are treated when no one believes they are important. The silence deepened. Maya felt chills run down her arms. Naomi continued. The most dangerous problems inside any organization are not the ones hidden in reports. They are the ones people stop noticing because they have existed for too long. Several employees lowered their eyes. Others listened without blinking. This morning was never about me, Naomi said. It was about every patient, family member, employee, and visitor who walked through these halls and felt unseen. Her gaze moved across the department one final time. You did not need to know my title to show respect. You did not need to know my position to ask questions instead of making assumptions. You only needed to remember that every person deserves dignity. No one spoke. No one needed to. The lesson had already landed. Naomi turned toward the elevator. The compliance review would continue. The investigation would continue. The work of rebuilding trust would continue. But as the elevator doors opened, she left the department with one final thought lingering behind her like an echo through the corridor. She had not raised her voice. She had raised the standard. And for the first time that morning, everyone understood the difference.